Wonderful. Well, welcome. And thank you so much for coming. It's really exciting to be here, and I'm really thrilled to be here with a wonderful panel. And just to kind of introduce the panel, we're going to say a few words. We're going to do the Mentimeter questions to see what you're thinking at the moment. We're going to have a little bit of a chat, but quite brief, really, because we're here because we love talking to people like you. We want to know your questions, and we want to have a bit of a discussion about your questions. So really looking forward to hearing your questions. But before we go into all of that, I'm really delighted to welcome Dr. Christian Reynolds, who is a reader at City St George University of London. Is an expert on sustainable diets, including cooking practices, an expert on food loss and waste particularly, and is actually editor of the Routledge Handbook on Food Waste. So really delighted to welcome Christian. Thank you. Are we doing? Yes, we're doing. I've not made it clear, have I? Excellent. Brilliant. We're also really delighted to welcome Dr. Tara Garnett, who is Director of Table, which is a global platform exploring debates about the future of food. And Tara's research is on food, climate and health, particularly on the livestock and meat issue. And Tara's particularly interested in the intersection of values and how they shape and the use and selection of evidence that people bring to the future of food discussions. So really delighted to welcome Tara Garnett. Thank you. And finally, delighted to welcome Professor Paul Behrens, who is a British Academy Global Professor at the University of Oxford, expert on climate, food and energy and the intersection between those. And Paul's book, The Best of Times, The Worst of Times, Futures from the Frontiers of Climate Science, is really inspiring, and I'm sure I'll recommend it to you all as well. And so we're going to kick off with a Mentimeter in a moment. You're going to be able to scan that to get started, but just going to mention a few topics we're going to cover with your question answers to those questions shortly. So really, we're going to discuss, what's the current state of the food system? How does it impact the environment? How stable is that food system to potential problems that might arise? For example, do we import too much food? And we're also going to touch upon the fact that food is very much a cultural question. It affects our daily lives. We're all eating every day, and if we're lucky, we're making choices about that food, and it's intimately linked to the way that we socialise and the way that we work as human beings. So many topics we can talk about there. And I'm just going to mention we've also put on your chairs there some cards which we use for discussions about this topic to get people thinking about some of the impacts and benefits of different types of food. So if you've got questions on that as well, we're delighted to discuss them. So I'm just going to turn to the panel in a moment, but first we're going to ask you a Mentimeter question. So question 1 on the Mentimeter is, I think it's going to turn up. Yep. Brilliant. Okay. Oh, you're already on it. Okay. So the first question is, what factors? My eyesight's not good enough to read that at the back. What factors are most important to you when making decisions about your diet? And we're asking you to rank these options from most important to least important. So options we've got on the screen there are personal health, environmental impact, affordability, cost, and ethical concerns about animal welfare and labour practices, for example. And we're conscious that, it's a very wonderful group of people that we've got here, and we're really curious to know your perspective on this. And we can see at the moment personal health seems to be winning, but the others are changing as you're voting more. So at the moment, environmental impact is coming second, and the ethical concerns are at the bottom of that list, although I'm sure they're all very important topics in your minds. So I'm going to just call it there, I think. I'm going to say personal health is 1, environmental impact, is close second and third with the affordability. and it's just been overtaken. It's a tense time here because we have come here to talk a lot. We're largely going to talk about environmental impact, I think. So, you know, this is going to put us in a difficult position, but we're up for the challenge, and ethical concerns as well on there at the bottom. Okay. Thank you very much. This has made it very exciting already. So we're going to go to the second Mentimeter question now. And this question is, would you be willing, or have you already changed what you eat to help the environment? We're conscious that you've chosen to come to a session fairly much on this topic. So we're very curious to see how flexible you are, or whether we're just really preaching to the converted already, which is looking like the situation with 24 votes now for yes. But some people are considering it, and 2 people who are anonymous at this point, I think, but are saying no. So we're very curious to see what you're thinking on that in your questions. But I think that yes is just increasing the more that we sit here. So I think we could probably close that poll at this point. And thank you very much for participating. And it's really great to know where you are with your thinking on this at the moment, so that we can adjust what we say accordingly. And maybe that's stimulated already some questions in your minds that keep those questions in mind, because we're very shortly going to come to you and ask you what they are. Okay, but before we do that, I just want the panel to reflect briefly on the current state of the food system. So, you know, how much should we really be thinking about changing the food system, if at all? So I'm going to come first to Paul.
Yeah, so thank you, Sarah. So, you know, you couldn't really sort of make up a system that's so damaging for so many areas of the environment right now. It is a system that's really stretched across the planet, about almost half of habitable land. 80% of that for animal agriculture is used for producing food. And if we have a look at all the different environmental drivers, agriculture is the second or biggest driver of pretty much all of them. So the second biggest driver of climate change, the biggest driver of biodiversity loss, the biggest user of fresh water, the biggest changer of habitats, the biggest driver of nutrient pollution. So this is nitrogen and phosphorus that kills water life. It's becoming the biggest driver of air pollution as we get the energy transition underway and the air is cleaning from the energy sector. We're actually getting more and more of the percentage of the proportion left is driven by agriculture. And what we know is that even if we were to do this whole energy system transition, so if we were to go completely decarbonise tomorrow, the food system would be enough to push us beyond 1.5 degrees. I mean, pretty much on the way over that at the moment anyway, so it wouldn't take very much. But even push us beyond 2 degrees of warming. So we really need to address the food system really urgently with the same sorts of efforts that we've been talking about in energy for a long time. And all of this for terrible health outcomes. I mean, health outcomes to the NHS, I mean, it costs us the orders of hundreds of billions of pounds each year because we are eating diets which are bad for us. And so we're not getting a very good deal for destroying the environment. You know, globally, the estimated costs are about $10 trillion. So actually, the food system is doing more damage, if we were to put that into dollar terms, than it's actually producing. So we couldn't really do too much worse at the moment. And I think we're going to talk a little bit about how to do better. So I'll leave it there for the moment, and we'll get into that in a minute.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Paul. Tara, do you agree, or do you want to add anything?
So I generally agree with you, Paul, that obviously the food system, and I just want to clarify what we mean by the food system. I'm sure you all know anyway, but it is the set of activities and the actors that comprise everything to do with food, from agricultural production, farming, the inputs to the farming process, after the farm gate, processing, distribution, refrigeration. You bring the shops, the supermarkets, you bring your food home, cooking, eating it, throwing stuff away. That is the food system, but it is also people. Has anyone here got a connection with the food system from professionally, perhaps? Yeah, so people who might work as cooks, people selling in shops, owning shops, whatever it might be. It's all you as well. That is the system. And the system is, as you say, incredibly damaging, but it also fundamentally the giver of life, why we are here, and the stories we tell about food, and particularly the story of whether things are getting better and whether things are getting worse. It's also a story of about what and for whom. So in many ways, we are healthier than at any other point in human history. More people are being fed every day. Fewer people, there's been a bit of an uptick, but fewer people as a global percentage are suffering from the problems of malnutrition. We are also now suffering from surfeit, from the problems of surfeit. So too much of the wrong kind of food. And I think it's important to bear all that in mind as well when we talk about the environmental damage, because another story you could tell about the terrible environmental damage that we experience is the ability to grow more food on a given amount of land, which also spares land for nature, which we should make more use of, because we should, but so that connects to the fact that the sorts of food that we are eating are also very land hungry and very emissions intensive. So this brings us to the question of meat and livestock. They, as Paul mentioned, about a third of global greenhouse gas emissions are attributable to the food system, of which about half is livestock, so the meat and dairy question. So if we are going to be thinking about the problems associated with our food system, we also have to think about the amount of animal protein in our diets. But I would say that it's also, the food system also employs lots of people. It employs people very unequally, very exploitatively, but it is also a source of living. It is a source of cultural identity, from, you know, farmers who farm the land through to the sorts of foods that perhaps you've grown up with, perhaps that you like to eat today. So it's a really complex tangle. So to say what is the state of the food system begs a lot of questions about the stories you want to tell about and where you want to go, really.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Tara. Great points. Christian, what do you think?
So, building on what Paul and Tara have said, I'm going to be a champion for that fourth block that people were less concerned about. There were other concerns in the room. So we were talking about health concerns in that Mentimeter were the dominant concerns. We then had affordability being weighed up with environmental impacts. And this is a London audience. We live in London, we have that balance. And in fourth place was that ethical concerns around animal welfare, labour rights, etc. And that's a common survey answer when you go across the UK, when you go across Europe. Those ethics often come below price, and they come below health from an individual perspective. And I think if we build on what Tara said, in terms of, say, giving that definition of the food system at the moment is also a food system for profit. If you think about what a food system is in terms of its outcomes, it's destroying the environment, it is causing animal welfare issues, it's causing labour welfare issues in certain points. It's an unjust food system, but it's also a really profitable food system for some people. And so Tara gave you this idea of the food chain in terms of from farms to fork, but there's also this middle bit of the food system, the missing middle almost from a lot of different discussions. And if you think about it, there are lots of consumers, there are lots of farmers, but there are a lot fewer manufacturers, there's a lot fewer processors, there's a lot fewer supermarkets. And so it could be about who are making profits from all of these things and supplying us food. So they are succeeding in getting food to us of different sorts of qualities and different sorts of environmental impacts. The other thing I would just highlight is this entire food system is built on food systems of times past. And by that, I mean that in the UK, we made choices, both, say, with the Corn Laws. If you've been educated in the UK, the Corn Laws definitely came up in your education. But from the Industrial Revolution onwards, the UK has chosen to use its colonies and imperialism to feed itself globally. And it was the first country to say, we can change our production practices in the UK and use others, and say with power that there are people who are being fed less because we are taking more. And that is a narrative or a style of food system that has now been deployed around the world with globalization. And the speed of change and the speed of negative externalities in the food system because of globalization has sped up dramatically. that's probably some really depressing things. Again, let's focus on Tara. There are lots of amazing things happening here, but at the same time, there's a lot of depressing things out there as well.
I just want to emphasise, I'm not the happy bunny rabbit around here. I mean, you know, it's like, what I'm trying to say is that there are reasons, there's lots of good about a food system, and I think what is really important is that we don't romanticise the past, because every time, every place has its own good aspects and its own negative aspects. So I think harking back to the past, there's a lot we can learn from the past, but I think we shouldn't be slaves to a romantic notion of a time when we were in balance with the earth, because I think, you know, that any balance that we might have had is short-lived. And on the question of trade and global trade, I mean, I think, you know, we exist in a really complex trade, you know, world of lots and lots of trade. But again, a very kind of simplistic idea that we need to go back to some kind, and the idea of back to self-sufficiency is also complex, because there has always been trade. I mean, think of the East India Company, which, you know, the precursor to slavery and everything else. But there will be vulnerabilities without trade, just as there are vulnerabilities with trade, and that the challenge here is to have equitable trading relationships that are based on high environmental standards. But that's probably getting into more detail.
Great discussion. Paul, do we import too much?
Well, I mean, we import about 40% by value of our food, and I guess the context in which this is all happening and we're moving forwards now is climate change and environmental damage. So not only is the food system driving many of the environmental crises that we see, but it's also heavily impacted by climate change. And this is really reconfiguring food production around the world, livelihoods for farmers, and what we can import from different regions, of course. And when we look at food price inflation over time, we do see this consistent inflationary effect now from climate impacts. It's not the only thing, but it's an extra driver. It adds on the extra layer of stress in society. So some estimates suggest that about a third of the food price inflation that we saw in 2023, that was driven by climate change. And so when you see the result of that, which is cost of living crisis, strikes across the UK, that's how you can quite quickly see how food really interacts with social stability. It really interacts with how states and how politics can change as a result to people just not being able to afford what they would like to afford and eat what they would like to eat. And so I think this question about trade is really important. And, you know, if you look at the literature on this, trade is exceptionally important for keeping access to food and keeping costs low. And so what one of the scarier outcomes that we sort of consider and we sort of model is if you do start to have these climate impacts, then if people then put in trade embargoes, and they say, look, we're not going to export anymore because we don't have enough grain. Grain prices are going up anyway. And that tends to have these knock-on effects through the global food system, where you start to have more and more countries then getting into sort of food insecurity issues. And we saw that with a Russian drought in the 2010s, and then that knocked on through the system and spiked grain prices. And again, that's when you start to see then the political instability in Latin America, in Middle Eastern countries. And so, yeah, I mean, it's a complicated question, trade. I mean, that it's nice to, where I think this is ultimately going personally is that large areas of the planet will become unavailable for traditional agriculture by the end of the century. And so what does that mean? That means that the areas that are more temperate, that are still able to produce food, we're going to have to become much better at producing healthier food and large volumes of it. Because it's one thing saying we're going to see some sort of future, but imagining some sort of future, but we know thermodynamically that's what's going to be happening with climate change. It is just heat. It is too difficult to grow food when it gets too hot. And so this question of trade is extremely dynamic as well in terms of what's going to happen with climate change, what's going to happen with extreme weather events in different regions, and what's going to happen to the ongoing increases in humidity and increases in temperature in the tropics.
Mm-hmm. Great point. So maybe we could talk a bit about the impact of climate change on food. Are you very worried about this, Tara?
Yes, I am. I just wanted to just also pick up on what Paul was saying about the fact that we have
a growing global population, and we will be needing to feed that population, and you have the added hit of climate change. But one of the things that we can focus on as a means of addressing that is thinking about the question of how much more food we actually need to produce. And this brings in the idea of waste. And I'm going to let Christian talk about waste in the kind of the more obvious sense. But one aspect of waste is the 40% of grains that we feed to animals. And that is that food, you know, once you've passed it through an animal, you get losses through the digestive process, and those nutrients are therefore not available for us. Leaving aside all the ethical concerns, if we were to eat those grains and in fact diversify our cropping systems to include legumes and other forms of plant products, then we would be more resilient to the problem of climate change insofar as the pressure would be less on to produce those volumes of food that we need in order to prop up our livestock systems. And also just to say that this is not an either-or situation, because it may also be that with climate change, not only traditional cropping patterns change, but there may be cases where you were cropping and you may have to switch to livestock because arable systems may not be. So it's not an all or nothing. I think the general picture is that we need to, in order to be resilient in the face of climate change, we need to very substantially reduce the numbers of animal numbers that we're rearing, but that doesn't mean nothing at all. And I'll let you talk about waste.
Well, we can tag team there in terms of waste. So the depressing again statistic that's bandied around is around about half of the food on the planet never reaches a human stomach. But that statistic also kind of includes the animal feed. So it's not as big as that, but we could be thinking around 1/3-ish of the food never reaches a human stomach would be a slightly more predictable line with the better numbers now. In the UK, the number is of consumer purchasing, one in every 5 shopping bags of purchased food ends up in the bin. So for those of you who voted for the cost of food, that's an extra 25% on your bills, just to kind of bring it down to the individual household level. But food loss and waste happens not just only at households, it happens throughout the food chain. So there is loss of food on farms, there is loss in the pack houses, there's loss at the waste at the supermarkets, and there's waste at the households. In the UK again, if you think about all of that waste, it's about 10 million tonnes. You can add about 4 million more on it, the farm, but let's just focus after farm gate onwards. 6 of the 10 million happens in the household. The rest of that's in the chain. So 4 in the rest of the chain, 6 at home. So there are definitely things we can do to change these and change food waste both in home, both out of there, but reducing the amount of waste means we are buying less or enabling other people to have more, depending how you think about food loss and waste. So there are 2 different narratives you could have. You could say it means that other people can be purchasing that food and we don't need to produce anymore, and eventually we'll reach a natural capacity of we actually don't need to produce anymore because we've reduced food loss and waste. And to speak to those 2 people who are saying, no, I don't want to change my dietary pattern, you don't want to change things.
They might be perfect already.
They might be perfect already, and food loss and waste isn't changing your diet. It's changing other bits around there. So it could be changing the amount that you're purchasing, and my favourite one, which is how many people know what their fridge temperature is at home. Because 60% of the UK has their fridges too warm. So you've got to have your fridge around 4 degrees or 3 degrees C. Most fridges in the UK are set at 5 degrees C, which reduces the shelf life of all of those high carbon and high cost things such as dairy, such as meat. All of those sorts of things in the fridge are a little bit less in terms of shelf life. But to bring it back to this, waste is a big issue, but it's something we could all do something about from that perspective.
Great. Well, let's talk a bit more about things we can do stuff about.
Yes.
So how do people feel generally, not this audience maybe, but how do people generally feel about changes to their diets? I'm going to come to Paul first. Who's responsible for this? And how do we convince people to make changes?
So dietary change is the biggest one. This is scientific consensus now across multiple different modelling studies. It's not a question of whether we need some level of extra plants in the diet. That's one way to flip it around than from cutting out animals, of course, animal products, but just how much. And so when you look at all the different interventions we can make, especially in high-income nations, it's the biggest opportunity we have. So in a country like the UK, for example, if we all move to a planetary diet, a diet that's good for the planet and also good for our health, and so this is like a burger once every 2 weeks. It's still got milk, it's still got cheese in it. It's kind of reasonable, maybe, in terms of a target. If we were to shift to that in this country, we would reduce our emissions from the food by 61%. And not only would we do that, but because we use so much land for animal agriculture, we would actually save an area almost the size of Scotland in the UK in terms of land. Now, if we were then to return that to nature, and so we were to do rewilding, active or passive, we were to pay farmers to sort of actively restore nature, we'd be able to draw down emissions and double the benefits. So we looked across high-income nations as a whole. If they made that change, we would draw down about 14 years of global agricultural emissions onto that land. At the same time, it would address our biodiversity issues. You know, it would allow us to do, if you do want to do things like timber buildings or bioplastics, it gives you the land to do that. I mean, this country doesn't house anywhere near as many people as it does animals. And so actually we're not really housing people in this country. It is more animals that we're doing. So we really need to sort of think about also the land piece on that. You know, one final thing to say on this, how do we see this change? The food system's a really interesting one because we are quite connected to the way the system sort of changes. So we vote 3 times a day with what we eat. Every single time that we make a choice, that is a choice that is changing things for everybody else. It was much harder for me to eat plants than my parents, for example, so there are options available to me now, and I think nowadays it's much easier, and it's easier than it's ever has been. And so we need to look at sort of countries that are looking into how you actually get this done, and one of them is Denmark, and they have a plant-rich action plan, and they've invested all along the supply chain and really allowed people that option to explore new diets, to explore new foods. Because let's remember, we eat a handful of plants every week, and that's actually thousands, if not tens of thousands of plants we could be eating. So I often think of it as a story of exploration, of diversity, of new meals, rather than something where you're cutting things out. And I haven't even really got onto the health part yet, but maybe I should leave it there. It's good. It's exceptionally good for your health too. So it could really alleviate. I mean, one estimate suggests that the NHS would save around 20 billion. The UK as a whole would save around 20 billion pounds a year if we move towards this diet as well. So
good point. Yeah. Okay. Great. Thank you. Well, Tara, what do you think about that?
So I think I'm going to try and answer your question in 2 parts, because you were talking about who should be responsible for the change. Was that more or less?
How people feel about it, who's responsible, how do we convince people?
So first of all, I just wanted to kind of spell out the obvious, which is the sort of the change that we want to see. And if you were to distill it into kind of 5 bullet points, it would be: don't eat more than you need, eat more plants, eat less meat, don't waste food, which can be interpreted very widely, and then question normal. So this comes into the question of we eat what we eat because we've always eaten what we've always eaten. This is how things ought to be. Don't tell me anything different. Tradition is a kind of an act of God that's fallen from the sky. So I think the question of questioning normal is a really important element of that. When we get into the question of the how and the who and the questions of responsibility, I think it can be looked at from lots and lots of different ways. First of all, we don't wake up and say, I want to eat myself sick. We eat what you eat because of what's legal, what's available, what's affordable, what's been advertised to you, probably what your parents fed you, what your friends eat, what's in the work canteen or whatever. So you are shaped by all these different forces. So yes, you make decisions, but they are edited decisions. So I think that's the bigger thing to think about. Therefore, who is responsible for changing that environment? And at one level, it's like trade relationships. It's international government treaties. At another level, it's our governments and the regulations they do or don't put in place. We've seen some progress recently with better standards for school meals, more universal access for those school meals for children. There's a lot more that government could be doing, and I'll let
Christian talk about the corporate stuff, but to, you know, stop corporates doing really bad stuff. Then there's corporate responsibility. I'll leave that for you, Christian. And then there's the question of personal responsibility. Now, if we dump it all on the consumer, on the individual, and say, oh, all these people, they come into my shop and you know, if I don't, you know, they want to eat, you know, Oreos and all this rubbish food, and if they don't buy it from me, then they will, you know, go to Sainsbury's next door and buy it. This idea that all the burden is on the individual is damaging. It's a way of letting governments and business off the hook. But there is also some truth to the fact that we are not all mindless zombies. We have choices and we can make decisions. And I think it's important to think about us in our various sort of incarnations. There's me as a consumer going to the shops, thinking about what I've got going to have for dinner, and I'm lucky to have choices, to have enough money, to have enough knowledge, to make reasonably good choices. But there's also me as a citizen and where I place my vote, and the voting decisions you make are arguably even more important than how you spend your money in Tesco's, because those are the governments that are going to shape the environment, including the corporate environment. Over to you.
Thank you. And other unhealthy biscuits are available.
Yeah, other unhealthy biscuits are available. Exactly.
Yes. Christian.
So this is an event called The Future of Food, and I think I will answer Tara's kind of point on corporate environments, but I think it's worthwhile thinking there are lots of different futures now possible. There are futures that are heavily environmental based. We go towards a clean transition, as Paul has painted in his response. There are also technocratic futures where we can science everything and science solves all of those different problems. But there's also corporate futures, as it were. And Tara's organisation Table has done an amazing booklet of 4 different futures possible, but just highlighting that there are these different versions or beliefs, and all of you in this room probably have deep beliefs and about what a good food system could be for you, and what a good food system could be for London, and what a good food system could be for the UK and the world. And those will probably not all match onto each other. But myself at the Centre for Food Policy, we've been doing research and showing that there are several policies you can enact that can lead to multiple of these pathways simultaneously. So it's not saying that we can't just, the technocratic and the nature-based futures, there are things we can do now that enable these to happen in the future, and for down the track these to happen. And if I'm being open, a lot of people react negatively to a corporate-based future, saying the corporations are deciding on our food. We don't have a say, we have less of a say in that future. But there are different systems-based policies, or policies at the local, national, and international level we can be pushing for to restrain different amounts of corporate power. So at the moment, a lot of people are voting with shareholder action and encouraging ESG, so environmental social governance policy, and shareholder activities. However, since 2022, and definitely since January when a certain administration came to power, a lot of companies have been scaling back on their environmental ambitions and their production ambitions and their EDI ambitions. And so if we are wanting to go towards a positive food future, be it nature, be it technocratic, we have to hold to account our own workplaces as well. So the food system is important because everybody eats, and we all operate within that. So in the UK, it's not as many people as it could be actually are directly involved in the food system, but I bet in all of our families we knew someone who is working in the food system as a delivery rider, in a restaurant, in farming. There are as an extended, and it's having conversations with those people to start saying how can they change and how can you change within your own ones. But again, that's individualizing as a citizen, let alone being an activist saying there are big systemic drivers that can be done at the same time. So there are different levels. Sorry, I'm echoing slightly. To go back to Paul's point for a final thing, just highlighting that there is this planetary diet. So a lot of my work, I'm on a EU-based project called Relish, which is looking at how do we change the culture of eating and looking at historic European food cultures. And we found that there are recipes and peasant cuisine forms and historic recipes that everybody has emotional ties to that already fit into the planetary health diet. It's about putting more beans, it's about putting more vegetables front and center on the plate, and it's about going back to recipes and changing recipes to fit into that dietary plate. So there's different things we can do, both culturally, both socially, and both as an activist. And as an activist, not both.
Well, I think that we should probably find out what you're thinking at this point with your questions so that we can respond to those. So hopefully you've got a sense of the wide range of expertise that we've got on this panel for you tonight, and really interested to hear your questions. So now's the time to start putting your hands up with your questions. If you could keep them focused as questions rather than general comments, that would be fantastic. But yeah, we'd love to hear your questions. Don't be shy. We've got a question in the middle there, and then one at the back after that.
Hi. You talked about kind of consumer and corporate agency in kind of making change here, but how do you think about the kind of economic challenges that farmers are facing right now, like even within the current kind of context they're operating within? And like, how do you create the economically sustainable agriculture that can feed people sustainably?
Excellent question, thank you. And we'll just hear the one at the back as well, and then we'll come to the panel.
I think we're on similar lines, and there was no mention.
A little bit closer for the online.
Okay, sorry. I think we might be on similar lines. I was quite concerned that there was no mention of the food producers, so the small farmers, the regenerative farmers that are, so for instance, when you say that producing meat through like cattle or dairy, I think if you do it regeneratively, it's actually carbon negative. So we're talking about really large scale farming, but if we go back to smaller scale farming, like I come from Jersey, I'm a food producer, and we are really trying to change how we produce food on an island that's become monocultural, just producing potatoes. Brilliant. Okay, great. So really good questions there, bringing in the producers. What's it like in terms of economics for farmers, and particularly for a lot of farmers who are doing, working really, really hard, that you've just mentioned there, to really try and make their farming more regenerative to nature. I think, Tara, you've written fantastic work on this, so could you come in on this one?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple. I mean, Paul will be able to comment more generally about the kind of the cost of farming and the subsidies that underpin the current farming system. When it comes to farmers who are struggling, this is absolutely the case. It's the case in the UK, it's the case in Europe, and indeed it's across the world. And some of that is things like rising fertilizer prices. Some of this is exactly what Christian was talking about the kind of the being squeezed by the retailers, who extract most of the profits. When it comes to the question of transition and what we need to achieve a sustainable, healthy diet, I mean, there's a few points to make here. One is the question of regenerative, and regenerative is a word that's used a lot, and it's based on a set of 5, sometimes 6 principles are used to denote the idea of regenerative, but it lacks a formal definition and is interpreted very, very widely. To give an example, some of the very smallest and most agroecological farmers refer to themselves as regenerative, but Nestle and JBS, a big agri-firm, also have a regenerative program. So it's quite a sort of vague concept. When it comes to the question of meat and dairy and livestock, I think, I'm going to be reasonably, I hope I don't come across as too controversial here, but we eat far too much meat in this country. Most of the meat that we eat increasingly is poultry meat, white meat, which comes with its own set of environmental problems. Red meat particularly from ruminants, comes with a different set of problems. There has been quite a lot of interest in the idea of rearing animals in such a way that they help draw down carbon from the atmosphere. The hypothesis is that through their trampling actions, they stimulate the production of the sort of deeper roots in the soil of the grass, which then sucks down carbon from the atmosphere, such that the emissions they generate through their methane and their nitrous oxide emissions are offset by the carbon that they store in the soil. There's been quite a lot of research into this, and what you generally find is that on balance this is not the case. At a global level, ruminant animals emit considerably more carbon than they sequester. There are examples of livestock in some systems, in some contexts, for a certain period of time until carbon equilibrium is reached, where sequestration can occur. Now, that's just a long way round of saying we eat too much meat. There is a role of meat for meat in the diet. They can play a role in traditional landscapes. They can contribute to the maintaining of farming traditions and identities. But if that meat is going to play a role in our diets, it's going to be more expensive. And therefore, we will have to be eating less of it, and that will raise questions of equity. It will also raise questions about the cost of food, which is a really difficult issue that I have to say most environmental NGOs are finding it really difficult to engage with, because the truth is that if we incorporated the environmental costs of production into the end price of food, it would go up. We have people going to food banks. How are we going to square this circle? It's going to be difficult for farmers. It's going to be difficult for people on low incomes. That is not an argument for not making the transition. It's an argument for putting in place the social structures and the supports to ensure that that transition is just and equitable. And it's also, and this is where I'll finish, finding new areas for people to secure livelihoods. For example, in horticulture, in legume production, and in many other aspects of the food system. And I'll stop ranting now.
Very, very helpful. Thank you very much, Tara. And come to Paul on this.
Yeah, on the economic side.
Yeah.
So in the UK, what we find from our modelling is actually the net income for farmers. So the farmers, before they receive the subsidies, if we were to make these shifts that we've been talking about, farmers would make more money. And the reason is that farmers are often producing at a loss in this country, and they're often producing at a loss on some of the products that we need to consume less of. And so in our modelling, what it seems to be showing, this is a preprint at the moment, so it's going through peer review, but what we're seeing at the moment is actually the net income, as I say, going up. And even if you take it towards sort of a very, very plant-rich diet, the net income barely changes, and you get a lot of extra subsidy that you could redirect. And that's what we're doing at the moment a little bit with the Environmental Land Management Scheme. So when we left the EU and we were able to go our own way with agricultural subsidies, starting to help pay farmers to restore nature on the land. And so, you know, it's different in different countries. In Denmark, actually, the reverse is true. They would make less money from this shift. So it really depends. But at least in the UK, we're kind of quote-unquote lucky in this sense that we could actually continue to pay farmers producing foods that we need less of, but for public goods instead, what we call public goods, things like environmental protection, things like floodwater protection. The very things that we need to deal with climate change and help us roll with the punches, we can help pay farmers, if we want to continue with those subsidies, to pay to do those actions. And just on this point about economics and how unfair the system is at the moment, I mean, if you really think about it, you've got this very narrow, as Christian was saying, this very narrow group of companies in the center of that hourglass. Lots of consumers, lots of producers, and then the processors and manufacturers in the middle. And they're dictating prices down to the farmer. They're often dictating prices that don't let them break even. And then what do we do? We come in at the end and we subsidize the farmers and pay so actually a lot of that money is essentially feeding through to the middle of the supply chain there in terms of the value added that the processors and retailers. I don't want to put all the blame there, but I mean that is in effect a dynamic that's happening within what's happening. And so if we have this shift and we pay farmers for this rewilding, for this nature restoration, we could actually move away from a little bit of that exploitation as well. Because if we do look at the surveys for farmers, it is an exceptionally difficult job, I think partly because of the corporate influences that Christian was talking about. But we also do see, interestingly, lower outcomes for mental health for animal agricultural farmers than for arable farmers. And in large part, that's because of the ability to go on holiday, that's the ability to be flexible, to have control and autonomy over your time during the day. So I think it could address a lot of these other issues, and I think the UK is kind of in a unique place where it's actually something that would be generally quite good for incomes of farms. I should just mention there is, sorry, I was talking a little bit there, but just to caveat that is that as farmers make this shift, often it's quite loss-making in that shift. So if a farmer does want to move from animal agriculture to horticulture, say, there's often a risk in the first few years as you're making that shift. It costs money. And so really and then you start to make lots more money after like 5-6 years. And so what you really need is the support to come in to help the farmers over that short period where they're making that transition. And partly that's providing the demand for the products so that they know that it can be on the market. And that's what the Danish plant-based action plan has done, is said basically. Oh, sorry. Sorry.
I just want to jump in
Yeah, yeah.
on one thing. I agree
Yeah.
with everything you say, Paul. But what we don't want is a situation where farmers move towards more environmental land management and products, the output of food goes down, but our consumption patterns don't shift, and therefore we offshore the problem to another country. We do not want that to happen.
This has really got to be sequenced well.
Exactly.
So just kind of picking up on those two things. So again, I'm going to just respond more to you than to just because I feel that regenerative discussion we've had, but we've not talked about farmers directly and what's happening there. So Paul said we need support. But currently, the government has, in some ways, frozen ELMS. It has frozen that short-term support, and it's not given direction and leadership in this area yet. So we are interviewing farmers about what is needed, and the current systems from DEFRA, the Department for Food and Rural Affairs, are not actually working for different farm types. They're working for some farms, but not all farm types. And so there is that opportunity cost, or that jump that a farm has to make. Likewise, farmers are getting older. The average age of a farmer is going up and up and up. And so the farmers who are older, when you do surveys with them, there is less likelihood that they're going to adopt these local things in a short term. They need to know and they need to have confidence that it's going to be a family or a wider change. So just highlighting that. The other thing I will just highlight from Tara's point, currently the average household is paying about 13% of its income on food. Historically, the UK has been really low. It got down to around 10 or 11%, but that's way lower than it was, say, in the turn of the century. I mean, 1900s, not 2000s. But it's a low amount. There are families that need to spend up to 40% of their income on food, or even higher if it was going to a healthy, sustainable basket. But there are ways that we can shape our purchases of food to be healthy and sustainable within the current budgetary spend. So cost doesn't have to be an issue, but overall, we do have to think about if we want to spend more money, it needs to get to the farmers' pockets. Like the ideal thing for me, if somebody comes up to me and says, what's your magic bullet for the food system? It's doubling all farmer incomes globally. The reason for that is because, unlike in the UK, globally, more farmers are women globally, and they're on small amounts of land globally, and that means that we're actually empowering regional communities and lots of other things happening there if we're doubling global incomes for farmers. But that's, again, a global food future of what I'd like, as well as saying UK farmers should have a doubled income as well. But those are different things. I'm sorry, we've just done two questions, and that was 10 minutes. Gosh.
I believe we've got some more from online. Thank you, Emily. And then we'll come to you and you after that. Yeah. Oh, yeah.
So this is our first online question. Do you think we should be concerned about the rise of nutritionally complete meals, drinks, and other products like Well, for example?
Other products are available.
Should we be concerned about the move towards these food products and the way in which it's likely to alter our relationship with food?
Okay, thank you. Noted that one, and then we'll come to you and capture that in the black polo neck. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. So also a question about some new foods. I don't know if the panel visited the exhibition at the Science Museum, which is called exactly the same as your panel, but it's a lot about some lab meat, lab dairy, not corn or whatever, oatmeal, but it's like proper, just differently produced. So do you think it has commercial potential? Will it take off to become a game changer, or will it still become like a niche experimental thing?
Great, excellent, a good combination. And just we'll hear the next one from near the back. Yep.
Hi, I'm just wondering what the panel thinks about the UK's preparation to an adversary attacking the food system. So what if there was like a cyber attack on supply chains in the UK? How well would the UK be able to deal with something like that?
Excellent questions. Okay, we're gonna discuss those, and then we'll hopefully have another round after that. So, first of all, the rise of nutritionally complete foods, is that a concern? What about cultured meat, as I think is the preferred term? Is there a lot of potential for that? And then maybe after that, we'll come to this very important question about our preparedness for potential crises like a cyber attack. So, does anybody want to come in on complete foods or cultured meat?
I could kick us off on the alternative proteins. So I think this is a sort of, if we park the sort of the corporate questions about that and the concentrations about that, there has been a reduction in the cost of these products over time. And the question is, will these products look more like wind and solar, where we see massive declines in the costs as they roll out? Or will those declines be more limited? So for me, whether I think in the real world they'll take off is really based on that cost perspective. And then the question it comes to me is that the reason why we have cheap wind and solar, which basically outcompetes everything, is partly due to the Germans paying more through their subsidies in the 2000s, sort of early 2010s. And then the Chinese basically building to produce that, and then their demand also kicking that off, because you need that demand in order for the learning to happen, for the cost to come down, and somebody needs to pay for that. So what I often think about is who is actually going to be paying for those technologies to become cheap. Now, we had a big excitement about these products about 3 or 4 years ago, big IPOs when these were listed on stock exchanges, and we've seen them sort of crash recently. And in part, that's been driven by concerns about ultra-processed foods, about manufactured foods. And I would say that in part, actually, this also feeds into the political economy of the question as well, is that there's been an awful lot of industry pushback against these products, precisely for being sort of ultra-processed. And actually, a lot of the lobbying groups have been interested in highlighting this, because as you saw in the question that was asked at the beginning, health is above everything. So if you can attack the health piece, then you can attack the whole sort of sector and field. And largely what we see from the health impacts is, whilst it's not as good as a whole food plant-based diet, these products are better than the high sugar or the meat containing processed foods by some stretch. And we see that across multiple different studies. Work is still being done on that. Yeah, so in terms of whether this actually sort of makes a big dent, I think it might, but it really is going to depend on what happens in the next few years in terms of investment, in terms of who's actually going to go first on this and bring the prices down.
And sorry, you should probably go. Just saying, in terms of the corporate question, because Paul sidestepped it.
Yeah, I left that
Yeah,
for
you left
Christian.
that. Just saying again, when you talk to these, if we're saying we're getting a precision fermented Wagyu beef, for instance, who owns the rights to that genetic material? Is it a farmer in Japan? Is it a farmer? Is it a giant corporation? Who's getting the money for the genetic legacy and the breeding of that Wagyu beef over centuries to then create one that's synthetic? Is it therefore all of that money going towards communities who have done this for centuries, or is it going towards a corporation who specialised this and created a specific genetic line? So there are discussions to have, whether it's on complex all foods or in terms of a synthetic milk or a synthetic beef, around justice and around equity and the political economy of it, as well as the scalability of it. Sorry, jumping out now.
Brilliant, Tara. Yeah.
I mean, the alternative proteins question is incredibly interesting, and I feel that it demands a whole discussion in its own case. I think that the fault lines are on debates around their real environmental impact, around their health profile, around some questions and ideas about naturalness, and then about the questions of power. And with all of those, it's really complex. So if you take the environmental profile, generally speaking, these foods tend to have a lower environmental impact than their meat-based substitutes, although not as low as, let's say, a bag of lentils. However, they can be quite energy intensive to produce, and therefore the question comes to the extent to which we manage to decarbonise the food you know, the energy grid and the kind of the competing pressures for that. When it comes to health, I think you've covered that off, you know, quite well. This debate around ultra-processed food is another complex one. When it comes to the other point about the environmental dimension is the extent to which these foods are substitutional or additive. So are they growing? I mean, I've been a vegetarian for since I was 17, and what I have noticed is that you go in and you look for some kind of vegetarian sandwich, and it has been so-called cannibalized by plant-based substitutes rather than, you know, what used to be in those sandwiches. So is that taking from the vegetarian sector, or is actually making inroads into the amount of meat we eat? And the evidence suggests that the death of meat eating has been exaggerated, kind of misquote. So, you know, people are still eating more and more meat. It's kind of plateaued a bit, and it goes up and it gets down, but it's pretty much there. So I think that raises lots of questions. On the question of naturalness, and this brings in the Whewell question as well, and the question of nature and culture, I find myself incredibly conflicted because I think accusations of naturalness, something being unnatural, you get into quite dangerous territory. Just think about other areas of our lives when you start pulling out the naturalness card. The extent to which it challenges, destroys, changes our cultural relationship with food, well, that's a discussion that runs and runs. We have all, our culture and food have always changed, and you also have to bring in questions about, you know, women in the workplace and all the rest of it. When it comes to the power question, I agree. There's also all the corporate concentration question, but there are also companies like New Harvest, which are all open source, open access. They are trying to model a different way of sharing and innovating. And this brings into the very last point. 70 billion animals are slaughtered each year, and that's on land, not on sea. Anything that actually says we don't need to get rid of all animal production, but anything that makes some dent in the numbers of animals that are reared really cruelly and suffer very, you know, are killed often in very inhumane ways. Anything that makes a dent on that should not be dismissed out of hand.
Okay, do you want to say anything?
Yeah, no, I was just thinking, and because we didn't mention it before, when we look at antimicrobial resistance and zoonotic diseases, I mean, we talked about the health, we talked about the environment, but there's this other huge area as well, and obviously animal agriculture, you know, drives a lot of that.
And just nobody's talked about the national preparedness. The other Christy's going to do that.
No,
but just one point to make. Resilience is about having lots of eggs in lots of baskets, and
not literal eggs, just to be clear. Yeah.
Well,
They can be literal eggs and powdered eggs.
If you have a system that is entirely predicated on lab-grown meat and on, you know, that, you have an unresilient system. But if you have that technology in your back pocket for other forms of environmental damage, then that adds some resilience to the system. So I think we should be exploring lots of different models of food provisioning.
So Tara's leading into the fact that I work at the Centre for Food Policy, and last year one of our professors, Professor Tim Lang, produced a report called Just in Case, which was looking at civil food resilience and preparedness to cyber attacks, etc. So there's a very hefty tome of a report which laid out plans for how we could have a more resilient food system in response to this, but also the fact that the UK's guidance currently on we should have water in our homes, we should have 3 days worth of food at home. We do not have a preparedness for the public, as well as we do not have preparedness for the wider food chain. And we need more of this resilience. We need more of node structures. We need more local farming. We need more local production. We need more local depots. All of these sorts of things need to happen. But we are only in those discussions now, and that has come to light since the Just in Case report came out. So please do look that up if you are interested.
Yeah, and I think, you know, what tends to happen before that report tends to be that people are maybe looking at specific examples of things that might happen, which would be a problem in terms of maybe you know, we can't import particular foods, we might have droughts, we might have floods, but actually the chances of quite a lot of these things all happening at the same time
Cascading.
cascading risks, which there may be related risks, that particular thing needs a lot more attention. And so there's lots of ways that we can do that in doing fun exercises, simulating that.
Just to give a really sort of specific example of what could happen there is, when we had the war in Ukraine and we had grain exports being sort of shut down, I mean, if at the same time we'd had the Evergrande in the Suez blocking, I mean, that would have spiked prices way higher than they did get. And so really it's these cascading the effects around the global food system, especially on some of those choke points, Panama Canal, Suez Canal, that really could affect what prices and the resilience and the call for having more locally produced food as well.
Yeah, a lot we could talk about on that. I think we should just have one final round of questions. We've got a question at the front here, another question at the front here, and another question over there. Thank you. I'm sorry, this question at the front here, yeah. Another question in the red jacket, and another question at yeah.
Thank you so much. I'm really enjoying this. I wanted to ask, speaking of genetics, I wanted to ask about GMOs. Its role in food policies and food systems, because as a consumer, as an ordinary person, it's really difficult to understand traditional, for example, traditional wheat, or the difference between traditional wheat and GMO wheat or beans.
Okay, thank you. Great, thank you. Next question.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask a practical question with all the sort of considerations you've been talking about this evening. Say I'm going for lunch, I'm going up the road to Tesco's, I've got £5 in my pocket, what am I going to get? Like, what's the best thing I can make a choice on?
Great, practical advice.
We've got the £5 limit.
Okay, and one final question over at the back, there, middle of that side. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I guess I have a question about what I should be doing. Do you think it's important that people my age learn how to grow their own food? And I was talking to a farmer the other day, and they were saying, I think one of the main things that you should all be doing is, to feel empowered would be to learn how to grow your own food, be able to provide for yourselves, be able to provide for your communities. Because I think there is a feeling of disempowerment that comes from always needing to kind of outsource all the time. I wanted to.
Excellent. Okay, great questions and really good ones to end on. Really, I'm afraid we're going to have to just try and whip through those three questions. So, how can we feel more empowered? Particularly, what should people go and do tomorrow, maybe, or maybe this evening? What should people be buying? And should they go and learn to grow their own food? Who wants to start with that one? Tara, you look like you're going to say something.
I'll have a start. So on the £5 limit, I would probably, it depends also how long you need to feed yourself for the £5 limit, but I would go for something like bread or wholemeal couscous. So wholemeal bread or wholemeal couscous. I would put in some lentils. I don't know if you have an extra budget for cooking. If you don't have an extra budget for cooking, I go for tins. I would definitely buy carrots because they're so cheap and they're good for you. And if you want something green as well, I would go for something green. I would probably get some kind of oil, if you can get a small bottle of olive oil maybe. And then I would buy yourself something nice as well, because I think that's also very important. But yeah, when it comes to the but you've covered your bases in terms of vegetables, protein, carbohydrates, and a bit of fat. When it comes to growing your own, I speak as someone who really hates gardening, so it's quite a terrible admission to make. I do think there's something really important with a sense of agency, and problem solving. So if you don't like growing your own, take up sewing or carpentry or something physical and practical where you actually are in a spatial relationship with the world, because I think that's really important. But whether it's growing your own food or whether it's doing something else, it's whatever you find interesting.
Shall I just bounce? Am I allowed to? So I agree with what you've said, Tara, but I also would highlight that not everybody has access to land now or will be able to in the future in the UK. As you've highlighted, there's a lot more animals than humans in this country taking up a lot more space. And so having that agency, but you know, I live in Islington, there are community gardens there are community sheds, there are other things, and having that sort of agency and having those experiences of tools versus information-based skills and agency. In terms of the question around what I should buy tonight from a supermarket, very similar to Tara, I used to work up in the Rowett and Aberdeen looking at what you could buy for the smallest amount of money for the best environmental impact. Custard creams are your highest per calorie for the lowest per price at level. So a pack of custard creams, which is currently 52 pence, is over 2,000 calories for a very small amount of custard creams. You can then buy, and I would go frozen rather than this, a bag of frozen peas. You can eat them without cooking, and it's a great legume. And so there's other sorts of things: peanut butter, shelf-stable, long legume, etc. So there's you get your fat with peanut butter. So again, that's thinking in terms of at the Centre for Food Policy, we have people who are crisis-based nutritionists. And so if you're in a crisis war zone, what are the things you eat? And flipping that question, and peanut butter is bloody amazing on that score. In terms of GMOs, happy to talk afterwards. But again, plant breeding has been going on for a long time, and we've been doing selective breeding. There are also the GMO types from the Green Revolution to today, and there are different sorts of plant breeding techniques within that. That has changed our carbon footprints, that has changed our yield amounts. There are modern types of plant breeding that are not just breeding for yield and the needing fertilizer. There are ones that are being bred for low water use, for climate resilience, for taking heirloom characteristics and spreading it out. I would encourage you to read up on YQ wheat, which isn't GMO, but it's looking at plant breeding and how we can breed resilient populations. Scientists are now using lots of different breeding techniques, including ones that were founded in that GMO, to do other things in the food system for multifunctional outcomes. I've gone over a minute. I'm sorry, Sarah.
Excellent. Okay, Paul.
Yeah, so in terms of the feeling of agency, I think one way we can all feel a lot more agency is understanding how much other people care about the environment, because we all underestimate it. And this happens again and again. So research in the US, for example, asked Republicans and Democrats, they said, you know, what percentage of people do you think across the country would support a carbon tax? And I don't know about you, but I think, you know, tax is a dirty word in the US, so I thought it would be pretty low. The estimate was about 32%. But then they said, do you support a carbon tax? And it jumped up above 60%. And if you looked at all those questions, the support is much higher than you think it is. And it's true in this country too. And so when we look about the concerns about climate change, we look at the sort of things that we're willing to do. You know, for example, frequent flying levies, the idea that we would pay extra for each flight that we take. So you get one non-extra flight a year, and then you pay extra for all the ones you take after that. Support for that is often over 70%. It drops a little bit if you say, well, are you going to be the one to? But it's still very much higher than you think. An interesting one I heard the other day is people who are intending to vote reform, which you think would have a certain set of values, about 70% or above 70% of people who intend to vote reform either like or don't mind wind turbines in the countryside. And so these are all really surprising things that, you know, I got wrong. And I consistently underestimate my neighbour. I underestimate all of us. And we all do this all the time. And actually, we do it within science as well, actually, in terms of our interest in actually speaking out and doing advocacy about the environment. So I think in terms of agency, one of the things we can do is talk more to one another about all these things. And, you know, it's one thing making your decision, voting 3 times a day, as I say. It's another thing then talking to people about it. Not in a hexering way. Nobody wants to hear that. But in the sort of like, you know, what's the experience? We're all going on a journey here. And what's that experience feel like to you personally? How do you emotionally engage with it? And what's it like for other people? And is that what they think about too? And so I think really talking to people is a really good part of agency as well as the physical part. And and we are close in other areas like the energy system. We don't have as much ability to define the system as we do in the food system. So I totally take on board Tara's point. We shouldn't be focusing, you know, only on the individual. It's all in a food environment that we're part of. But we do have these choices, and we have agency every day when we make them.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Well, I think that's a fantastic note to wrap up on. You know, I do get people coming to talk to me at these sorts of things saying, I'm already, you know, vegan. When I cook potatoes, I cook 100 in the oven at once and then freeze 99. And I cycle everywhere. What else can I do? And, you know, somebody in that situation, a lot of you already maybe change your diets to think about the environment. What else can you do? And actually, you know, if you look at the numbers, if you're already on the low end of, you know, who's contributing how much to climate change, if you're already really cut that back, then it's a diminishing returns. And actually going and talking to someone else and causing them to reduce their climate impact by 10% could actually have a bigger effect. So that's a great note to say. Tell everybody such a fantastic evening you've had, if you have had a fantastic evening. And I believe that the event is recorded and you can tell people to watch it online as well. So really fantastic points. Thank you so much for all your fantastic questions. And please join me in thanking the panel again. Thank you.